Hello, and thank you for joining us. We want to provide you with a series of instructional videos all about applied behavior analysis and verbal behavior, and how we utilize ABA, or applied behavior analysis, as a science of learning, and also get into the art of teaching, specifically teaching language skills to children with autism and other developmental disabilities. So this first part is going to be kind of an introduction to the wonderful world of applied behavior analysis and some of the basic principles. So when we get into ABA, or applied behavior analysis, the first thing to talk about is behavior. So there are two ways to look at behavior. There are behavioral excesses and there are behavioral deficits. And so many people, when they look at children with autism, that's all they're concerned with is the behavioral excesses. But more importantly, we would say, is to be able to look at the behavioral deficits, or how both sides of these affect each other as well. So behavioral excesses are those overt behaviors that many people, when they think about behavior analysis or think about behaviors, that's what they think about. And children that might engage in typical kind of tantrum behaviors, or property destruction, or aggression, or self-stimulatory behaviors, or maybe even self-injurious behaviors as well. And there are, of course, many other behaviors that children with autism might engage in, but these are the typical kind of behaviors that we might see. And many people are most concerned about how do I reduce those inappropriate behaviors. And that's important. Behavior analysis can be effective in reducing inappropriate behaviors, but by and large, applied behavior analysis' greatest benefit in working with children with autism is actually looking at the behavioral deficits, those behaviors that we don't see, right? Many of our children with autism have a great severe deficit in language skills, but they also might have deficit in social skills, or basic learner skills, or independent functioning skills, or academic skills, right? And so this is how we look at a child with autism. And if you took your child with autism, you wanted to take them to a doctor and get diagnosed, right, or re-diagnosed, and see if they still have autism, right? This is what they would look at, basically, is a series of behavioral excesses and behavioral deficits. If you look at the diagnostic criteria for children with autism, that's basically what it is. There are a number of behavioral excesses, right, that children with autism might engage in. And even more importantly, there are a great deal of behavioral deficits, those skills that children with autism aren't engaging in that they should be engaging in by now. So that's how we look at a child with autism with the view of applied behavior analysis, is there are certain behaviors that are happening too much that of course we need to reduce. But more important, there are a whole lot of behaviors that aren't happening enough. And we need to specifically find out what those behaviors or what those skills are and teach those skills so they don't have as much deficit in that area. So the second thing to know about behavior is that behaviors don't happen in a vacuum. There's always things that are surrounding behavior. And that's what we call the antecedent and consequence conditions. So the antecedents are what happens before the behavior, and the consequences are what happens after the behavior occurs. So again, our job is to have an influence on certain behaviors happening more in the future, or certain behaviors happening less in the future. But we don't control this column directly. What we control is everything that surrounds the behavior to increase the probability that certain behaviors would happen more in the future, or increase the probability that certain behaviors would happen less in the future. So looking at the antecedents, the behavior, and the consequences, that's why we say behavior analysis is as easy as ABC. The antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. This is typically called the three-term contingency, or what Skinner called operant conditioning, and looking at applied behavior analysis as a science of learning. So the antecedent is the stimulus that happens before the behavior. There might be certain conditions or certain predictors of behavior. Children might act differently at different times of the day. We might act differently with different people or different physical settings. We might act differently in different activities, or with the presentation of a particular stimulus or the removal of a stimulus. Those are everything that happens before the behavior is what we call the antecedent. And then we have the behavior that occurs. And at first we're going to be talking about the topography of the behavior, or what the behavior looks like. Definition of a behavior is the interaction of muscles and glands of an organism. Basically, behavior is anything a person does or says is a behavior. Many people, when they think about behaviors, that's all they think about is all the bad stuff. But we also have to be concerned about all the good stuff that needs to happen more, right? And the consequence is the stimulus that happens after the behavior occurs. And here's where children with autism and children in general and all of us are trying to get access to a particular stimulus, or trying to get the removal of a particular stimulus. And this stimulus is what's going to increase the probability of the behavior occurring in the future, or decrease the probability of the behavior occurring in the future. So this consequence, although it's in the back end of the ABC contingency, right, is really kind of the engine that drives the train. And so that's where most people start when they start talking about applied behavior analysis, is starting to talk about the consequences. So in the consequences, where we come to terms that you might have heard before: positive reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. But it's important to know that these terms are defined functionally. First, by their operation. So when we hear positive, all we hear is that there was an addition of a stimulus. So that's the positive and positive reinforcement. And the positive and positive punishment is that after behavior occurred, there was an addition of a stimulus. And negative only means the removal of a stimulus. So that's the negative and negative reinforcement, and the negative and negative punishment is that after behavior occurred, there was the removal of a stimulus. And they're also defined by the effect on the behavior. So reinforcement is always increasing the behavior. So that's the reinforcement and positive reinforcement, and the reinforcement and negative reinforcement is that the stimulus would increase the behavior occurring in the future, and punishment is always decreasing the behavior. So that's the punishment and positive punishment, or the punishment and negative punishment, is the behavior is decreasing. So whenever we hear positive, all we hear is the addition of a stimulus. When you hear negative, all you hear is the removal of a stimulus. So positive and negative have nothing to do with whether it's good or whether it's bad. That's kind of subjective. So we have to be objective, and it's more of a math problem. If you hear positive, all that meant was after behavior occurs, there was addition of a stimulus. And negative means after behavior occurred, there was a removal of a stimulus. And then we look at reinforcement, again, is always increasing the behavior, and punishment is always decreasing the behavior. So these terms aren't what we think they are, that these are punishers or these are reinforcement, right? It depends on the effect on the behavior and the operation of the stimulus. So if we heard, here's the test, if we heard that after a behavior occurred, there was addition of a stimulus that decreased behavior, we would say addition of a stimulus is positive and decreasing behavior is punishment. So that's positive punishment. So that's how we figure it out, right? If there was the removal of stimulus to increase behavior, removal is negative, increasing behavior is reinforcement. That's negative reinforcement. If there was addition of stimulus to increase behavior, addition is positive and increased behavior is reinforcement. And if there was the removal of stimulus to decrease behavior, removal of stimulus is negative and decreased behavior is punishment. And so that would be negative punishment. So that's how we figure these things out. And that's how we functionally define these terms.